Okay, hi everybody. Thank you again so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. My name is Stephen Noonoo. I'm the K-12 editor here at EdSurge, and EdSurge is a news and information resource which help bring the best in education technology through our news stories, our research programs, our community activities, which include live conferences and events such as this webinar. At the end of last year, EdSurge joined ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education. And ISTE is a nonprofit organization that serves educators interested in the use of technology in education. So today we'll be focusing specifically on what traditional online learning can teach us about emergency remote instruction. And for today's webinar, we've lined up a trio of really dynamic thought leaders on the subject. A quick note before we begin, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you by email after the live event. And if you signed up for the webinar, you'll also receive updates about future webinars on this topic. So you can ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll bring your questions into the discussion as we're able. And we also encourage you to use the chat to say hello and share resources, but please do put those questions for the panel into the Q&A specifically. Before we get started, I just want to draw your attention to a guide from EdSurge and ISTE. It's called Navigating Uncertain Times: How Schools Can Cope with Coronavirus. And it's really where we're collecting all of our stories, our contributors, and the resources that we'll be sharing today and that we'll have in the future. So bookmark that at readiness.edsurge.com. And there's also a new site from ISTE and a host of other education groups called Learning Keeps, which features a ton of resources, including an educator help desk, and that's online at learningkeepsgoing.org. So I'd like to introduce the panelists on today's call. I'm so honored that they could share their time and expertise with us on short notice. Today we're joined by, Kerry Rice, professor at the Department of Education Technology at Boise State University. Rick Ferdig, the Summit Professor of Learning Technologies and Professor of Education Technology at Kent State University, and Tory Trust, Associate Professor of Learning Technology at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So before we dive in, I want to tell you a little bit about why I put this specific panel together. Our previous webinars have featured lots of teachers and K-12 practitioners, but as we're settling into remote learning, there are so many questions and unknowns. So I wanted to go back to what we do know, which is the existing evidence and research out there, and start making connections and approximations to our current situation if possible. So these are three of the smartest researchers and academics I know on the subject, and I think we're really going to learn a lot. So I have a few quick questions, and then we can move into taking your submitted questions and other questions. So Rick, I want to start with you. We spoke for my recent story about how much time we should spend each day on remote learning, and you shared a little bit about traditional online education. Can you explain for us how it's similar or different from the remote instruction that we're doing today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things that I think people may not understand is online learning has been around, K-12 online learning has been around for quite a while. We know that it got its start in the mid-90s, and you and I have talked before, but for those of you who don't know, they were a little bit closed off to wanting to do research. And part of the reason is they were under so much scrutiny to, what they were doing and whether they were competing with face-to-face schools, but eventually they let researchers in, and so in the early 2000s and on, we started collecting research, and there's been a lot of really good work being done on online learning. I think that's important to point out because a lot of people think that what we're doing now is new, and in some ways, for a lot of people, it is new. But I think there's been a lot of really good work done in K-12 online learning. And what we essentially find, and I'd be interested to see if Kerry and Tory agree, is, this is my friend Andrew Henry and I did some work in the Bell South region on this in the early 2000s, that, there's probably like a 15-70-15 rule, where, there's 15% of the teachers who were kind of prepared for this, and they were doing some form of online or blended instruction ahead of time. And this transition wasn't as difficult for them. There's probably 15% of the people who have never thought about this and have really struggled over the course of the last couple months. And then there's probably that middle 60 to 70% of the people who have been willing to try some things. And I would say some of the things they're doing actually resemble some of the good things that we've seen happen over the course of the last 15-20 years in blended and in K-12 online education. The challenge is how do we get that 60 or 70% to actually do the kinds of things that we know have been successful through the course of the last 20 or 25 years in research. And I don't know, Torrey and Kerry, I don't know if you'd agree with those statements.
Yeah, I always agree with you, Rick. I was actually just looking at the survey data I've collected recently, that a doctoral student of mine who works at a local high school was like, we need to collect some initial insights around teachers making this shift to emergency remote teaching, and right as it's happening to get some on the ground data. And one of the questions was, what kind of experience do you have with remote teaching and online teaching? I'm looking at the data right now. It's 67%, like no experience, and 15% little experience, and about similar results for online teaching. So it's a huge number of people who I think we're just kind of building the plane while flying it. I think that's the term I use now to describe everything that's going on. But I do agree, through my findings, we've seen that teachers who were engaging in blended learning, or flipped learning, or using technology in innovative ways had a much easier transition than other teachers who just weren't aware of the tools and teaching strategies to succeed well in remote and online learning. So yes, I agree.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
really interesting. Kerry,
sorry, go ahead.
I want to ask you a really related question, which is, I just want to tell the audience that you have experience training teachers for online learning. So can you respond to Rick and Tory in the context of, the fact that you have trained teachers in online learning and what that looks like today?
Yes, and I do agree with what both Tory and Rick said, and I think I look at it from a kind of a systemic view, a policy view, and looking at the large school. And I do think that district did remarkably well actually happened, given the limitations that they have in supporting teachers in online teaching and learning. So I've been involved in training teachers since 2006 in teaching online. We contracted with some of the very limited fully online virtual schools to train all of their teachers. I've done a lot of research in teacher PD to kind of see where we at as a nation in training our teachers, even for technology integration and blended learning, but mostly for online learning. And even our fully online teachers, which is a very small percentage of all teachers, of those 40% don't actually receive any training at all, even though they're teaching online. So my experience is that teaching online requires a real shift in thinking about your role as a teacher, from, when you have students who are a captive audience, to trying to teach students who are scattered in time and place, and in distractions and focus and all of those kinds of things. So it takes a real shift in thinking about your job as a teacher to be able to teach online. And one of the ways we can kind of bridge that gap really quickly is actually having the experience of taking an online class, which doesn't happen very often, but is one of the easiest things to do, to get anybody to really understand what that environment looks like and feels like and behaves like. So I'll stop there.
I wonder if I could jump in real quick, and I mean, you nailed so many important things from the research. And if you want to know what does the research say, I mean, number one is and most people who are now teaching online have never taken an online experience, which is a problem. Number two is there are skill sets that are similar to what we would do in a face-to-face classroom, but they play out differently in an online classroom. And or there are unique skill sets or unique engagement. There's a lot of teachers right now that are engaging with parents in ways that they've never had to engage with before in a face-to-face class. So you've got that going. And then the third thing is, and I can say this from teacher education program and looking at teacher education programs around the world, we're not doing a good enough job of preparing. I mean, if you go to a college of education, say, what are they doing for internships or practical experiences that actually put kids in online classes, or teaching online, and we're just not doing that. So if you merged all three of those together, we've got a problem of, people haven't had the experience as a student, they haven't been trained as a teacher, and there are skill sets that they can't just guess and hope they get right.
Yeah, so the obvious follow-up, I guess, to that is what can we do right now, given the fact that summer's coming up and we may still be doing a lot of online instruction in the fall. Kerry, can you briefly take us through with some best practices, and then maybe we can loop around to Rick and Tory?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll say first that there will be a natural kind of transition by teachers themselves just from having this experience. So they may have started with synchronous instruction, and then pretty soon you realize that that's not feasible all the time, and you start to generate ways in which to overcome those inaccessibility issues and distraction issues by recording your videos and lectures. And so there's kind of this natural transition already, I think, just from having the experience. One of the, I think, most fundamental skills and needs is this creating connection with your students. And so it's a lot different. It looks a lot different online than it does in a face-to-face classroom, where you can focus on a whole group, or one or two individual students who need extra support. When you shift online, that whole group focus kind of becomes obsolete. So you have to approach your role as a facilitator for each individual student and meeting their needs. So that's just number one. So coming up with ways to stay connected with your students, very consistent feedback loops and communication loops. What we find in our data mining research is that the most successful outcomes are from students who are the most consistently involved in or engaging with the content and the materials. Not necessarily how long they engage with them, but how consistent they are. So having this built-in structure is one of the very first things that you can do in a foundational element. And then you can move on from there and incorporating other kind of strategies.
Yeah. Tory, any suggestions about where teachers can go from here?
It's actually something I've been working on, in particular a little bit for higher education, my College of Education faculty. I feel like it's been pulling teeth, I think is a nice term, to try to get faculty to use learning management systems or use technology in innovative ways. Across the board, I'm seeing this, not just my university. And all of a sudden, unfortunately, it took a global pandemic to get people to shift their teaching. And I think we have a really rare moment to keep that momentum going. So I'm going to post a link in this chat box that I've developed a summer PD choice board that has an article from Kerry and has some EdSurge articles. And the reason behind that is I do think that there needs to be formal training to help educators. But I think the second that we do like a 2-day institute, teachers are so burnt out, and we've got this global pandemic to deal with, and there's so much going on. The formal training in the way that we traditionally see formal training, I don't think is going to be the best route. And so this choice board that has been posted in the chat box is a way that I've created for my colleagues to have some fun and go at their own pace. And it's learning party, something I came up with at 3 a.m. of course, and P stands for pedagogy, A is for assignments, R is for research, because K-12 teachers need to look at the research and higher ed need to look at pedagogy and research. So I'm like, we need to bring those fields together. T is the technology, and then Y, I ran out of ideas, so I put year 2020, but that's where I get into things like self-care and mental health and well-being. And that's what I'm seeing from my research right now is we can't go into formal PD and just push, here's teaching strategies and here's teaching tools. What we really need is we need to create spaces for teachers to socialize in a way that they would socialize in their hallways, to have conversations that they're missing in schools, to kind of decompress and reflect upon this experience and how it's affecting their own personal health and well-being, and focus on that self-care. I think it's often forgotten about. And in one of the articles that I submitted to Rick's amazing Journal of Technology and Teacher Education is we're looking at tweets from educators, and a lot of educators are turning to the remote teaching or remote learning hashtags and sharing things like, you know, here's where I'm teaching from today, and it's a picture of them on their laptop at the poolside, or here's, you know, remote teaching day 3, this is my success. And teachers don't have that space anymore when they, you know, the physical space to connect and have those kind of informal social and emotional conversations. And so I really hope we don't leave those out when we consider the summer ahead. And I also hope that we find ways to make it fun through choice board type activities or blended learning experiences. So it's not just this, you know, attend webinar after webinar or formal training. That's what I would love to see.
Oh, can I so agree with you, Tory, so much. And I am, you know, that's my business is training teachers, but this is not the time for, you know, sit down formal training. I totally agree. It's a time for, you know, sharing, right, exactly, sharing resources, strategies, what works, what doesn't work, and slowly bringing in the training. You know, eventually there will have to be some kind of formal indoctrination to online teaching or blended teaching, but I agree, this is not the time.
See, and I was going to come back in and say the very first thing we should do is set up training for teachers. So now I can't say either. I can't say it. No. So the very first thing, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I agree. Very first thing I see a huge list. I think there's 330 attendees, and I'm hoping, guessing many are teachers. And first thing I would say, because I forgot to start this way, is thank you. You know, you are doing a task that you weren't necessarily prepared to do, and you're doing it in a way that you were asked to do it quickly. And so we thank you, and you should hear that. You were already underpaid, and so now you're being asked to do something that you weren't asked to do. So thank you. The one thing I agree with a lot of what was said. Be a student. I agree, you don't necessarily have to be in a formal situation, but there's a lot of really interesting online, short, little professional development experiences this summer. Even if you go to, you know, Coursera or something, just to feel like what it's like to be a student, because for a lot of teachers, the first experience, even if it's just a day or a week adventure, will change their perspective. The second thing I would say is, again, learn from the experts. I mean, Tory and Kerry have written a tremendous amount. You know, I can't even get my mom to read my academic writing, so I don't, you know, the academic writing may not be necessarily always accessible, but I know that, you know, state-led virtual schools, you know, good friends at Michigan Virtual and Florida Virtual, Georgia Virtual, they've been doing work for 10, 15, 20 years in this area, and they actually have materials to support you know, teachers engaging in online experiences, everything from what does it look like to teach physical education online to what does it look like to work with students with special needs. So don't ignore those resources that they've been working on for, you know, 15, 20 years. The third thing that's really important for me, and I think both of you touched on this, is this idea of setting expectations. You know, teachers often do this the very first day or the first week of school, right? It's the, you know, here's what you can expect from me. Here's when you show up. And that first week is always crazy because students are getting used to your personality and your style, and, you know, when they have lunch and when they're supposed to go do this and when they switch classes. And the reality of it is this is, I mean, they're not used to this. For most students who have never taken online classes, this is a whole new world. And they're wondering, when do I contact you? Am I online with you? Am I not online with you? Do I email you? Do I call you? Do we get in a Zoom meeting? Parents are wondering, how much am I supposed to actually engage? Which, by the way, we can talk about, because there's some interesting research on what parents can do successfully or not do successfully. But the point is I think we've seen success in K-12 online instruction and early pandemic research on setting expectations for themselves, setting expectations for, and consistent expectations for their students, and setting consistent expectations for their parents. Those are the kinds of things that I think teachers need to be thinking through this summer, and then looking for resources. And the final thing really quickly is, Tory mentioned, we have a special issue with Journal of Technology and Teacher Ed out on COVID response, pandemic response by teachers and teacher educators. That will be open source. The related book will be open source. Both will be out in June and freely accessible. But what strikes me from both of those experiences is the number of people that are out there willing to support and collaborate with teachers and willing to help out. There's amazing things going on all over the world. And so, ranging from pre-K all the way to post-secondary. So if teachers are willing to reach out and say, I need help, I need to explore some things, will someone help me? I'm amazed at the amount of response they're getting.
Yeah, thanks. I think that was a ton of really great tips, especially be an online student yourself. I mean, that's so important. And informal training might be less overwhelming than formal training. I think that's really great. Torrey, you had done some work in social media and professional learning networks for teachers in the K-12 space. How are you seeing social media and professional learning networks kind of evolve and shift to meet teachers' needs these days?
It's something I really enjoy studying because it's a divergence from typical professional development. And there's nothing wrong with typical professional development if it's done in small bite-sized learning experiences, but far too often when teachers go into webinars or workshops or whatever from their school or district, it rarely connects with the direct needs they have in the classroom that moment. And where social media and the ISTE professional learning networks, Twitter hashtags, Facebook groups, even Voxer spaces have popped up as these kind of informal spaces to get those needs met. And right now it's ever so important. I saw on Facebook there was the Global Educator Collective support for remote online teaching. Within a week, went up to 150,000 educators, and then they ended up having to create a sub-Facebook group for every subject in school. So there's one for science and math and PE, and even one for parenting. And I joined a whole bunch of those, and I've not only learned a ton, but been able to contribute and support teachers who are looking for technology support. And same with Twitter. One of the study I was mentioning, they submitted to the JTATE journal, is looking at how hashtags like remote teaching and remote learning have really popped up and just exploded in the number of tweets and posts, because teachers are looking for supports and what tools are out there, and there are ways to get their questions answered a lot faster from what I found. Turn to social media and you have 20, 30, or 100 responses versus trying to ask, your poor district IT person who's trying to do, PD for everyone in the whole district at the same time. And I have the greatest respect for instructional designers and IT people right now who are keeping up with all this and supporting everyone. But social media can also serve as that complementary space where teachers can go. And I've definitely seen those spaces really pop up, which is incredible to see teachers turn to social media to meet their needs, not just cognitive needs of like, I need to learn a tool, but as I mentioned earlier, the kind of social and emotional needs are important as well. And so I encourage you all to get connected in different spaces, whether it's whatever social media tool that you are connected with, Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, but also the teachers in your schools, because I find that the teachers who are connected feel less isolated, feel like they're able to take more risks and try out new things. And this is the time we need that. We need those social spaces to have the support to take those risks to learn about new tools, to try things out. So I highly recommend trying out to find some spaces to explore for your own support and learning.
Yeah, that's great. Kerry, you recently wrote a piece, which we can share in the chat, about engagement in online learning. What do we know from research? What are some best practices for really engaging students when it comes to this?
So like I've said before, my research in data mining has to do with engagement, mostly the behavioral part of engagement. What are the behaviors that promote engagement and that predict success? But it's mostly in online, not necessarily in remote. And so they can transition, the findings kind of can transition. It has to do with those connections with students, so emotional connections, and connections with parents. So that's really a huge shift for traditional classroom teachers, is how do I connect with parents? What is the role of the parent in an online program or school, or a responsible adult? And how can I support parents? So one of the, I think, best things you can do is find out what parents need, first of all, and then how you can support them in supporting their child as they engage in remote learning. Let me think of some other things. So the consistent feedback loops for sure, personalized feedback, using different forms of communication, so video, audio, text, email, just so you connect with as many different types of learning preferences as possible. So I'd take input from anybody at this point. There's a lot in that article, actually, and there are a lot of suggestions for people. I can actually look at it and see. Yeah, the parent support, I think, is huge. I think one thing that is probably the most challenging is online discussions. And so that's something I've kind of tackled in a blog post as well. So it's a kind of a strategy that takes a lot of practice to do well. But it is one way to begin to engage with learners in a different way than synchronous webinars, and to get students who perhaps aren't normally interactive in the physical classroom to interact more in the online classroom. There's a lot of a different aspect to an online discussion that allows reflection and time to think that sometimes doesn't happen in traditional classrooms. So that's a really good skill for teachers to develop.
Yeah, that's great. Rick, when we talked the other day, you had mentioned we were talking about flexibility, how educators need to be more flexible. I'm guessing you're referring to the 70% of educators you talked about before who are willing to try but may not know where to get started. We talked about flexibility, and we had a question in the Q&A about how much screen time and what's appropriate. Can you talk about how this flexibility can be used by educators to kind of shift their pedagogy a bit?
Yeah, I got a couple hours. Is that what, do I get a couple hours? So there's so many, let me try to unpack, there's so many good things in what you just asked. Let me talk the screen time thing really quick. So for those of you who, I mean, I'm concerned about this. Prior to COVID, we, obviously the association, the pediatrics came out with recommendations for, and they've done this for a while. Most of the recommendations are for under 5. And as you kind of go above 5 to 18, they get really, really loose. And I've been really concerned about that because, just in Facebook groups, you ask parents, okay, hey, how much does your child, how much screen time do they get? And, the kids are on, 3, 4, I mean, I was expecting 20 minutes a night, hour a night. I mean, they're on 3, 4, 5, 6 hours a night. So pre-COVID, we're concerned with, as schools are going more in this online environment or blended environment, are they balancing out how much screen time kids are getting? And now, I mean, I have a real concern because, if teachers are concerned about how much, face time they're getting with their kids or how much work the kids are doing, it's possible that they're spending copious amounts of time in front of a screen, and that's not always best practice when it comes to online instruction. I think people have this perception that if it's online learning, it means you're sitting in front of a screen doing this online learning. And I think that's a misperception. We could talk about some pedagogies there. So screen time is a big concern for me. And I think we're going to have to pay attention to that as we move forward. I think the flexibility piece is, and again, we borrow this from medicine, but medicine is a complex domain, and we understand that there's not one right way to go through it, and so you have to kind of get multiple angles through the content. And the reality of it is people start talking about how much time online or how much time for doing specific things, they have to understand that students are going to be, they're going to self-differentiate based on how much time they go through specific content. They're going to have to provide, even if you look at some of the universal design for learning principles about, providing different ways to get access to different content. They're going to have to think a little bit more flexibly about kind of how students get access to that content, how students are being assessed for that content, and then their own thought about who they are. If I show up in a face-to-face, fourth grade classroom, there's a certain type of engagement that I'm expecting from my instructor. Well, if all of a sudden my instructor is online and I'm at home, what does that look like? And what is that fourth grade teacher's role compared to when he or she was in a classroom? And so I think it's going to take some flexibility in thinking about what their role is in that classroom. And again, all of these things, if they sound incredibly complex, they are, because again, these are things that people build up over years of time. They're not something they're thrown into in 3 weeks and they say, okay, let's go. And so I think, again, going back to what do teachers do next, I think situating themselves in that student learning space and figuring out what it's like to be in that role, and then really thinking more deeply about their role as supporters and engagers, rather than having to have face-to-face screen time all the time with their students, because that's not what typically works well in some of the online instruction. Kerry, you said it really appropriately, that one of the things about online discussion boards is not only does it allow every student to show up, but it also gives them time to actually process the kind of conversation rather than having to respond on the fly. We know from research, face-to-face classroom teachers will ask a question, then move on within 2 to 3 students. Well, if you're in an online environment, you actually have the opportunity to have all students participate. And again, even that shift or change in concept is something that teachers have to be flexible in their thinking.
Yeah, that's great. Tory, do you have any thoughts about the screen time discussion when it comes to this emergency online remote learning? Are students getting too much, and what should teachers really be thinking about?
Yeah, I was briefly glancing at the chat as well, and I was looking at a lot of the comments around equity and access to devices. So when I was looking at the hashtag remote learning, hashtag remote teaching, the most of the things that were being shared tended to, lean towards synchronous learning experiences. It's something my colleague, Dr. Royce Kimmons, pointed out was, here's something about Zoom or Google Hangouts, or, all these tools that we assume with a shift to emergency remote teaching means just continue what you were doing, but in front of Zoom. When in fact, I found that this is a good time to be a bit more creative. And I agree that we don't want to overdo it with screen time. And I worry when we require screen time, so much screen time from kids. And I think this is the time we really have to push creative thinking. Like if I were to ask teachers to learn one thing over summer, it would be to work on their creative thinking skills and give them like a topic and material, whether it's high or low tech, and say, figure out a way to teach this learning objective through this, just be really creative with their thinking. One thing I posted in the chat box was a link to an interdisciplinary STEAM activities choice board that can be done high or low tech and in a lot of, so it comes back down to, how you teach. It does not have to be hour-long, 3-hour-long lecture. In fact, that's what I've heard from my students in my classes is across the board, they have been really frustrated with their learning experiences at UMass because faculty have just gone on to continue to just lecture for 3 hours. So I think, quality creative teaching is really required. And what I would like to see is, 10 to 15 minute mini lecture, go and do an activity for 30 to 45 minutes, come back and discuss in groups. Like there's so many different things you can do. Like I love using the breakout group feature in Zoom to have students do their own conversations. There's so much junk and fun things that kids can play with at home. Like you can teach all of your topics without technology or with limited technology. So if you are in a low SES district, high poverty district, I imagine that many families may have a smartphone at the very least. And so you could have your students maybe try to record themselves doing a science experiment or respond to a Flipgrid, or do a screen recording where they talk over a YouTube video and narrate it from their own perspective. Or you could have them go out in the yard and collect data and analyze it and write about it and cover science and English language arts, throw some math in there. You can have them go to the recycle bin and see what they can invent and build, like have a building competition and then, assess the math that they used and the science behind what they created. One of the things I have in the STEAM activities choice board is a haiku hike. Go out on a hike and then come back or walk around the block and then write a haiku about it. No technology is needed there, but if you do have access to technology, maybe you add some photos on it and turn it into a short video. So that's why I really would love to see educators get creative, and choice boards are a great place to start. And using the universal design for learning principles really guides my teaching, and I really think that that is an ideal model for looking at quality teaching both in person and online, and giving students choice in how they learn content, so they're not just stuck in the front of a screen, but they can watch a video or listen to a podcast without looking at a screen, or read a text that they print out, giving them choice in how they engage. So letting them use stuff from around the house or stuff that they are interested in. A lot of students have to babysit younger siblings, like high school students, or they had to pick up extra jobs. Have them write about that, journal about that, design videos to teach younger siblings. Like, I think there's so much potential out there. We need to not just see technology as a way to replicate what we were doing in K-12 schools, because that's gonna push too much screen time on kids, when that's, learning should be about creative thinking and fun and collaboration and social engagement. And a lot of that gets lost in what I'm seeing. There's a great article on EdSurge. I mean, EdSurge seems to post everything that I love to read, where Richard Culata, the CEO of ISTE, is talking about the 5 traps of online learning. And the very 5th one was, online learning is not fun. And I saw that, I'm like, it's hard, because then we think we have to put materials online and students have to be in front of a screen, when really, like, we can do the same things we were doing in classrooms if we are creative with how we use tools, both digital and non-digital.
Yeah.
And Tory, wouldn't you also agree that, I mean, your last statement, the extent to which teachers attempt or are successful at replicating their face-to-face practices online, just duplicating it is actually equal to their lack of success, right? But if they're willing to think differently about this process and what the medium gives them, that's where they're successful. But I think to Sarah's point too, Sarah made a point in the comment about these suggestions only work for educators willing to shift their mindset about how to do school. Ding, 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 jackpot. I mean, that's the answer. Then the challenge becomes, how do you actually work with teachers to help them shift their mindset and understand that this is not just, and somebody put this in the quick Q&A too, this is not just emergency instruction, but this has actually been a research-based proven method by which to successfully instruct. And so how do you shift that mindset from an emergency and we just have to replicate what we did face-to-face to this is a different medium for instruction, and we can capitalize on that and actually have positive outcomes.
Yeah, Kerry, do you have any response to this kind of flexibility needed so that we're not replicating our instruction directly from traditional education to online?
Yeah, that was a lot, a lot of really good information. Thanks, Tory and Rick. I go back to that, what I talked about before, that I think some of this will happen naturally. So as teachers see that their students are not responding well or succeeding with their traditional methods being moved to just shifted to online, that they'll have to be creative, that they have to come up with some other ways to get to students. So in terms of time, screen time, I mean, face-to-face screen time in online learning can be really minimal if the activities and strategies used are adequate. I think right now, though, one of the real issues we have is parents and parents being thrown into the role of having to support their child in school and in homeschooling, basically. So that kind of throws a wrench into everything. So how do you keep kids occupied in the home so that parents can go about their business as well and not have to constantly be supervising their children? And it you know, I think some of the suggestions Tory made are really good at kind of bridging that challenge in involving parents in some of the projects. So coming up with projects that advance, you know, science standards or math standards. Baking and cooking in the kitchen is a really good way to you know, cover some math content, and getting outside is great for science. The other thing I wanted to kind of speak about was collaboration online. So that can be a real challenge, especially if you don't think creatively about how to bring kids together. And there are, you know, some traditional methods that are easily transferred to online. So jigsaw activities where, you know, kids become experts and share with other kids. Those can be facilitated through discussion forums or shared Google documents, or they can even be done low tech.
Yeah, that's
In person, right? Yeah.
you just for a second,
Okay.
Kerry. Thanks.
Oh,
So we're
sorry.
getting some really great questions in the chat, which is one which I want to pose to all of you, which is, if you're in K-12, where do you go for good research-based strategies? Tory, do you have any quick thoughts?
I mean, the journals, there are a few journals, ISTE journals, JDLTE, that's teacher education, but it's got some great insights. Journal of Research, Technology and Education, JRTE. And then, of course, Rick is the editor of JTATE, Journal of Technology and Teacher Education. Chuck Hodges does Tech Trends. And all of those are relatively, you know, they're not overly researchy. I'm sure there's a better, more academic term, but they're not filled with a ton of technical and academic jargon that you would see in some of these bigger, you know, journals that have that kind of academic flair. What I really like about the journals I just mentioned is, like, even if you're able to review the abstract, you're able to glean some quick insights. So I would love to see more teachers just maybe even setting up Google Scholar alerts, although that's maybe a big ask to, you know, if there's something of interest to them, flipped learning or HyperDocs or Zoom or something, to get alerts on from Google Scholar when someone publishes about that, then it comes right to their email inbox. I do that, and so it's just, so I don't have to keep searching for new research when it's published, but also just going out and looking at these journals and doing a quick search for things like blended learning or online learning. There's also, has some really long name, IRRODL. I'm sure someone could write out the title for me. That one's open access and has some longer articles. I also subscribe to that as well. So I'm constantly just like keeping on the pulse. I don't want people to get overwhelmed. So, you know, that's why the Google Scholar alerts kind of helps bring it to you, or doing a search for something that you're interested in. Is a good place to start. In social media, we have the social media ed hashtag, so there might be hashtags out there. There might be you know, spaces to learn more about that. Or in the ISTE Teacher Education Network, I'm on the leadership team there, and we have a fair share of leaders who publish research and are doing ongoing research and share some of their results. So there's definitely spaces, and I'd love to see more teachers, and I know teachers have no time, so I know this is a big ask, but you know, maybe find something, a passion topic for research, and spend, you know, like 1 hour a month as a small way to get into looking at what's out there and doing some reading and asking some questions. I think that is a great entryway. And I also think teacher educators and scholars need to do a much better job at promoting their work. Because as Rick mentioned, and I'm sure more than his grandma reads his posts or his articles. I read them too, Rick, don't worry. So you've got two readers. But far too often, the research we publish, we're excited if there's like 3 citations. And, nowadays, like my 2 colleagues, Jeff Carpenter and Dan Krutka, they have such a huge Twitter following that when they publish an article, it gets like thousands of views. And that's what I love to see. It's like they're publishing research and it's going straight out to educators to learn more about that. So it's both ends. Like, I don't want to put all the onus on K-12 teachers to go find it. I want teacher educators and scholars and researchers to make it much easier to access the information so that we can improve education together. Yeah.
Rick, anything to add? Oh, Kerry?
Yeah, can I just add 2 more resources? One is the Aurora Institute, which used to be INACOL, which is the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. And they have a lot of white papers and publications and resources that are friendly to everyone. And the other is a new organization, the Digital Learning Collaborative. So they're fairly new, but will certainly have some resources as well.
Yeah, so I would just add a couple really quickly. As Troy mentioned, I edit the Journal of Technology and Teacher Ed, and we said, hey, let's follow this medical model and let's find out who's doing stuff right now to work with teachers and during COVID. And instead of it being like a 18 to 20 month process of publishing 25-page articles, let's make these small, consumable 500 to 1,000 word pieces, and let's make it open source. And we expected, 20 to 30 submissions. We got over 265 submissions, which showed how many people were doing cool things around the world. And the nice thing about this is, it sounds like shameless self-promotion. It's not. It's promoting really cool authors like Tory, but it's all open source. And there's a lot of websites that are like, oh, try this and try this, and I think those are useful. But then you also want to balance that with, well, how do we know if it works? And so that will be published at the end of May, and will be open access. And I'd be happy to share that with whoever's interested. The other piece I would say is, again, and I keep going back to this, I'm sorry for repeating myself, but virtual schools have been doing this for 25 years. And I'm going to get in trouble. I have friends at various different virtual schools, so I'll get in trouble if I name one and not the other, so I apologize in advance. But for instance, Michigan Virtual has a Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. I just posted the URL, and I mean they've been taking what they've been doing and translating it into research that's actually consumable by practitioners as well. Florida Virtual, I know, has stuff. I mean, not every state has a state-led virtual school, but a lot of the ones that do have state-led virtual schools have been producing research-based best practices in online instruction, ranging from pre-K all the way to post-secondary, in everything from language learning to online PE. So let's not, again, I know a lot of research is not consumable by the general public, and that's our fault. And Tory's right. Blessedly, she and Kerry write in a way that people can read. But I think there are good resources out there that help us understand from a research-based perspective what has been working. And again, what we know works is that there are a lot of things in face-to-face K-12 instruction that carry over to online instruction. You still have to do assessment, you still have to do instruction, you still should do collaboration, you still have to do individualization. But there are things that are different in this K-12 online space. Kerry mentioned the ability to engage with parents. Eric Block did really good work in the research that showed that if parents are overwhelming and they try to actually help teach their kids, the kids actually do worse. And I hope none of my kids' teachers are online, because then they'll come back and tell me that I said this. But it's actually true that the kids will do worse. But if a parent is willing to switch into a role of being supportive and helping with organization and helping with check-in and helping negotiate, navigate, then their kids actually do significantly better. Well, how does a parent then take that and first of all, or how does the teacher learn that and then translate that into a parent to say, look, we don't want you teaching. We want you to be there and be supportive and help us through this process. Well, this is research-based practice that we know about. And I think that a lot of those sites that I mentioned have access to some of those pieces.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So I wanted to touch a little bit about, we had a question in the chat. Does online education best practices, does this look different for younger students than it does for high schoolers? How does it look different from, you know, first graders than it would for high schools? Not just in the number of hours, but also, you know, the types of activities that students are doing, and how do you think about keeping things developmentally appropriate? Kerry, do you have any thoughts if we start with you?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of research on very young children in online learning. There's not a lot of actually examples of that. So in my mind, the younger you get, the closer to a traditional type of classroom you get. So young students like in kindergarten are going to need synchronous, structured time with teacher, where in high school you can allow a lot more autonomy. So it's kind of builds over time that student agency and autonomy has an impact on how much teacher time, direct teacher time is needed. So that's kind of a general rule. Am I still coming through? Okay, my internet's like unstable. um, and we know middle school is a really tough time, especially for concentration and focus for students. And so there needs to be, I think in middle school, the challenge is distraction. And in high school, the challenge is attendance. So, because a lot of high school students are in credit-based recovery courses and already challenged. That's what we know. They're already challenged with completing and being successful in face-to-face courses, and then they enroll in online courses. So they just have different needs based on age group, and it's really important to understand, number one, why a student is taking an online course, because that has a lot to do with how successful they'll be. In the case of remote learning, we know why everybody is taking remote classes. And so I don't know that you know, the research is applicable. I'd love to hear what the others have to say.
Yeah, yeah. Tory, any thoughts?
I haven't, this is not my area of research, but I want to say that K-12 teachers know their students best, and know what's developmentally appropriate in terms of content. I think in terms of how people learn, quite honestly, I think it's the same from kindergarten to adults. We love play. We love to socialize and have conversations. We love to explore things we're interested in about. And so for me, you know, I think it's up to the teachers how they scaffold that with parent support. And I know that older students are able to be more independent, but I think we forget a lot of these things as kids get older and to college. It's like, oh, they just need 400 student lecture hall. It's like, how are we forgetting that, you know, the basic principles of learning by observing others, having conversations, struggling and failing and learning from failure and taking risks and building things, hands-on, minds-on learning. So I think that's really important to consider across the grade levels, is when we do think about remote and online learning, is not just see older kids as more capable to spend more time on a screen, or more capable to watch really long lectures. I hope it actually is the opposite way, of take what we know about kindergartners and how they enjoy learning and bring some of those ideas, elevate those to make learning more engaging, so we don't have that, you know, number of dropouts. And there's research to show the lack of engagement that increases from the second you leave kindergarten to high school. It's just more and more students disengage with school. And I think that's because we are facing some of those issues I just talked about of creating less engaging learning experiences when it should be the opposite way. So I just wanted to remind everyone of that as we're designing these learning experiences.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Is this kind of related to your point about parents, Rick, when we talk about developmentally appropriate learning?
Yeah, I think it is. Although, I'll say, so we have these academic words that you've all probably heard of or thrown around a lot, but, this pedagogical content knowledge, which is, understanding pedagogy or understanding how to teach, and content knowledge is different than pedagogical content knowledge. So understanding how to teach and understanding math is different than understanding how to teach math. And what I would suggest is that, if you put together, some high school teachers, middle school teachers, elementary teachers, and just talk pedagogical content strategies, they would have very, very different strategies. Things like assessment and classroom management and so forth would, the topics would be similar perhaps, but the way that they actually address those things would be different. And my concern is that if we give them a building and we give them a room and we give them the training, the teacher education to do that, they go do the things that are developmentally appropriate. The challenge is all of a sudden we hit emergency learning, remote learning, and what happens is they're thrust into a space where they're given a technology that may not necessarily be appropriate for the pedagogy that is represented by their age or their developmental age or support. And so, for instance, if we all of a sudden say, oh, well, we all got to go on, this technology, we all got to go Zoom. Okay, well, why? What pedagogical strategy is that fulfilling? And so what we've been trying to say to teachers, regardless of whether they're a kindergarten teacher, and I've seen some phenomenal, some of the best, I mentioned 265 articles that were submitted last week. Some of the best examples are actually from pre-K and kindergarten teachers who are doing fun things with robotics and doing fun things with getting kids outside and playing, and they're going outside and taking digital pictures. Now the challenge, which I understand the elephant in the room, is the amount of time we need to discuss this, the amount of time a parent needs to be involved in these things. And I understand that. But some really, really cool developmental things that are happening that are pedagogically appropriate. And the things where I've seen teachers struggle is this one size fits all technology is saying, this is what you're going to use to reach your students. And the reality of it is it doesn't necessarily match pedagogically. And that could be at the high school level, it could be at the lower grades. If I say, everyone's going to use Padlet, well, okay, that might be, that might work really well for certain content areas or certain age groups, and it may not work well for others. So I think school districts really have to be thoughtful this summer about the availability of the kinds of tools that they provide teachers to be successful, not so that they can get, a certain amount of face time, but that they can actually do the kinds of things that they intend to do pedagogically. And again, the parent issue is huge because, I can take, a high school student, say, okay, although maybe we can't, say you have a little bit more flexibility and freedom to accomplish these things. And again, the parent takes on this role of a supporting other. It's a little bit harder to hand a 5-year-old a Bunsen burner and some chemicals and say, go do your chemistry work, right? So, there's obviously some play we have to do. But Torrey, actually, I know you said it's not your area of research, but I think you were right on earlier when you said, we know that age of discovery, and if teachers are in this mindset, especially the elementary teachers are in this mindset of, and I'm not saying they are, but of, I have to have X amount of face time with these kids. Now, that may or may not be true, and they may not actually be able to accomplish the pedagogical skill sets that they have or they need.
Yeah, that's
I want
great.
to piggyback on that really quickly because I love shameless self plugs, which I know Rick doesn't. He's like barely puts his awesome work out there. But this was my students and I co-authored a book, Teaching with Digital Tools and Apps, that's open access, freely available on the EdTech Books platform created by Dr. Royce Kimmons. And we have a whole chapter called Evaluating the Learning Experience. And it just reminded me what Rick was saying is it helps you go through and look at why do you use different tools for different reasons and how do you evaluate based on learning theories, based on ISTE standards, based on Bloom's taxonomy. So it gives you different frameworks for choosing which tools to use and why, and helps teachers think through that. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I put it in the chat box as well, mainly because I'm like a proud parent for my students putting this incredible ebook together.
That's great. No, thanks so much. And Rick, do you have just 1 second to talk quickly about that project where you got taking from medical, you've got like 260 submissions on short papers and how that will be released?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education focuses on the intersection of either in-service teacher professional development or pre-service teacher education. And we put out this call, got 265 articles. The probably somewhere around 30 of them, including our good friend Tory, will have an article in there. They will be short research pieces that will be available in an open source platform. I'd be happy to share that with EdSurge and the EdSurge audience. However, we also have probably around 220 articles that were really, really, really amazing stories about caring parents and teachers doing amazing work. And so that will actually be put into an ebook that will be incredibly accessible, short pieces organized by content area and grade, research-based best practices, but yet consumable for anyone. And it will, the only way they get accepted into this is if they actually have implications for practice, direct implications for practice. And that will be out in probably 3 weeks, maybe beginning of June at the very latest. And that will be completely open source, open access, following a medical model of, we're not going to wait 2 years and look back and see what happened. We're going to try to give as much help to these teachers as we can. And again, a final plug, I'm so sorry, but I just have to say, again, to the teachers that are out there, thank you so much. You know, what you're being asked to do is you know, I hope you get some rest this summer, because you some well-deserved rest coming.
Yeah, that's great. I want to echo what Rick was saying. Thank you so much to all the practitioners in K-12 out there listening. We really appreciate you attending and all of your hard work. We know you've kind of been thrown into this, and you're doing a great job. Again, my name is Noonoo. I'm the K-12 editor here at EdSurge. We provide the latest resources and news about how technology is shaping the ways we learn and teach. Please feel free to sign up for our free newsletters or find out more at edsurge.com. To check out more of our webinars, go to edsurge.com/e/webinars. Our next webinar in this series will be on June 12th, so we'll send reminders by email, and you can access our previous webinars at readiness.edsurge.com under the webinar heading. Thank you so much to Kerry, Rick, and Tory once again for their time and insights. And thanks to everybody for attending, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.